There is a moment after 50, quiet, almost ordinary, when you realize something has changed. Not because anyone announces it. Not because someone openly rejects you. Not because a door slams. It happens in a room you already know. Maybe the kitchen. Maybe a family dinner. Maybe a meeting room with cold white lights above the table. Maybe a living room in the evening, where the television glows softly and everyone is looking down at their phones. You are there. You are present. You hear the conversation forming. Plans are being made. Decisions are being discussed. Someone asks for advice. Someone else answers. A younger voice takes the lead. And for a moment, you wait. Not dramatically. Not bitterly. Just quietly. Because some part of you still remembers a time when people naturally turned toward you. When your opinion carried weight. When your presence changed the room. When your silence was noticed. When your experience was not something people politely acknowledged, but something they actually needed. But this time, no one asks. The conversation continues without you. The decision moves forward. The room does not become hostile. That would almost be easier to name. Instead, it becomes smooth. Efficient. Complete. Without your voice. And that is what hurts. Not that they attacked you. Not that they dismissed you cruelly. But that life somehow learned how to keep moving without checking whether you had anything to say. You look around the room, and nothing looks broken. The lights are warm. The plates are still on the table. Someone laughs. A chair scrapes softly against the floor. The world continues. But inside you, something stops. Because you realize this may not be a single moment. It may be a pattern. Maybe they have been asking you less for a while. Maybe your children stopped seeking your opinion gradually. Maybe coworkers started routing decisions around you. Maybe your partner began assuming you would simply agree. Maybe family members still love you, but no longer look to you. And this creates a strange kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being physically alone. A deeper one. The loneliness of being present, but no longer consulted. Still in the room, but no longer central to the room. Still experienced, but no longer treated as necessary. And perhaps this is one of the most painful transitions after 50, you do not lose your value all at once. You notice, slowly, that people have stopped organizing their decisions around it. And the first instinct may be anger. Then sadness. Then silence. Because how do you explain a wound no one technically caused? How do you say, I am still here, without sounding like you are begging to matter? How do you admit, I miss being asked, without feeling weak? But maybe this moment is not only about loss. Maybe it is the beginning of a deeper question. Not, why don't they need me like before? But, what kind of presence must I become now, if I no longer want to be heard only because of the role I used to have? Because perhaps, after 50, authority cannot survive only as memory. It must become presence again. Not louder. Not bitter. Not desperate. But undeniable. And maybe this is where the next chapter begins, the moment you stop waiting to be asked, and start asking what kind of man people cannot help but listen to. For a long time, your role may have carried your authority for you. Father. Husband. Provider. Leader. Experienced one. The person who knew how things worked before other people even understood what was breaking. And maybe, for many years, that authority was not imaginary. It was earned. You worked. You carried weight. You solved problems before they became disasters. You stayed calm when others panicked. You made decisions under pressure. So naturally, people listened. Not because you demanded it. Because your role and your reliability made listening practical. But then, life changed. Children grew older. Your home needed you differently. And perhaps even more jarring, the workplace changed too. Picture it, a glass conference room. Bright overhead corporate lighting. A polished table. A younger team moving quickly through strategy slides. Fast language. New systems. New software. New assumptions. You sit there, shoulders still strong, decades of pattern recognition behind your eyes, and within 10 minutes, you can already see the flaw. Not because you are smarter. Because you have lived long enough to recognize expensive mistakes before they fully form. You know where this decision leads. You know what they are underestimating. You know which detail will cost them later. But something has changed, no one pauses. No one turns. No one says, "What do you think?" The meeting keeps moving. The room has not attacked you. It has simply learned to function. Without instinctively organizing around your experience. And that realization can feel like a private humiliation. Because maybe, you are still deeply capable, but your old role no longer guarantees automatic relevance. This is where many men suffer in silence. Because part of them still believes, if they understood what I've built, they would listen. Maybe. But later life teaches something harsher: past usefulness does not automatically create present authority. And that truth can either break a man, or rebuild him. Because when role-based authority fades, you are forced to confront a deeper question: who am I, when title, position, and old necessity no longer speak first for me? This is why some men become louder. They interrupt more. Correct more. Remind people more often who they used to be. Because they are trying to force old authority into new structures. But often, that only accelerates irrelevance. Because authority that constantly announces itself, usually signals that it fears disappearing. So perhaps, after 50, you are not being asked to reclaim your old role. Maybe, you are being asked to evolve beyond needing it. To become a man whose authority no longer depends on title, but on precision. Clarity. Emotional steadiness. Useful pattern recognition. The kind of presence that makes people eventually realize, we should have asked him sooner. Because maybe, your old role opened doors. But your next authority must walk through them on presence alone. One of the hardest things to admit is that people can still love you, and no longer consult you. They can call. Visit. Send photos. Remember your birthday. Invite you to dinner. Say they care. And still, make the real decision somewhere else. This is what makes the wound so confusing. If they hated you, you would know what to call it. If they abandoned you, you could name the grief. But this is subtler. They still include you socially, but not strategically. They still make room for your presence, but not always for your perspective. They still love the person you are, but no longer depend on the authority you once held. And after 50, that can cut deeper than expected. Maybe your adult child mentions a major decision after it is already made. A move. A job change. A financial choice. A relationship shift. You listen calmly. You nod. You try not to show the sting. But inside, something asks, when did I become the person who hears about things after the fact? Maybe at work, a younger colleague presents a plan that would once have passed through your desk. The room agrees quickly. No one asks what your experience sees. You notice the flaw immediately. Not because you are smarter. Because you have seen this pattern before. But you also notice something else: the room is not waiting for you to speak. So you choose silence. Or you speak too late. Or you speak with a tone that carries more hurt than precision. And then people hear the emotion instead of the wisdom. This is how invisibility can feed itself. First, people stop asking. Then you feel hurt. Then you either withdraw or react. Then they ask even less. Not because your wisdom disappeared. Because your pain began standing in front of it. And this is where the real challenge begins. Because the pain is legitimate. It does hurt to be loved but no longer consulted. It does hurt to become optional in conversations that once depended on you. It does hurt to watch people build lives on foundations you helped pour, then forget to ask whether the structure is stable. But if you let that hurt become your voice, people will hear the wound before they hear the wisdom. And that is dangerous. Because after 50, your influence often depends less on how much you know, and more on how cleanly you can deliver it. Without pleading. Without accusation. Without trying to reclaim a role through emotional pressure. This does not mean you become cold. It means you become precise. You learn to speak when your words can land. You learn to wait without disappearing. You learn to offer wisdom without needing obedience. You learn that being consulted is not the same as being respected. And sometimes, respect must be rebuilt through the way you carry yourself when people forget to ask. Because maybe your next authority will not come from being needed. Maybe it will come from becoming so grounded, so clear, so emotionally unshaken, that when you finally speak, people recognize the difference between noise and weight. Being ignored does something dangerous to a good man. Especially one who spent decades being useful. It does not always destroy him loudly. Sometimes, it corrodes him quietly. He becomes sharper in tone. More cynical. Less generous. Not because he became cruel. Because pain that has nowhere honorable to go, often starts hardening. And maybe that is one of the most dangerous truths after 50, bitterness is what happens when unused wisdom has nowhere honorable to go. Picture him, late evening. Garage light low and yellow. Tools on the wall. His hands still capable. His phone screen glowing in the dark. Family messages. Plans already made. Work decisions already shifted. Big conversations, already happened. Without him. And perhaps no one intended cruelty. But intention does not erase impact. He sets the phone down. The silence thickens. And slowly, a question becomes around, am I still useful, or just familiar? That is where bitterness often begins. Not as rage. As self-protection. A quiet internal withdrawal, they'll figure it out. No one listens anyway. Why should I keep offering? And for a moment, withdrawal feels powerful. Because withholding can feel like reclaiming control. But over time, bitterness creates a tragic distortion, the very wisdom that could still make you valuable, begins arriving wrapped in resentment. Your insight sharpens, but your delivery hardens. Your experience remains, but your tone becomes heavier. Your care still exists, but now people feel accusation before guidance. And this is where good men accidentally help create the very irrelevance they fear. Because people do not only listen to information. They also listen to emotional atmosphere. And bitterness makes wisdom harder to approach. Not because your truth disappeared. Because pain began standing in front of it. This is the trap. Ignored men often believe, if they finally understood how much I know, they'd listen. Maybe. But if your wisdom arrives carrying unresolved disappointment, many people will avoid the delivery before they ever discover the depth. So perhaps, the real battle after 50 is not only reclaiming relevance. It is protecting your wisdom from becoming poisoned by invisibility. Because bitterness is not power. Bitterness is grief wearing armor. And armor may protect pain, but it also makes connection heavier. So maybe, your next evolution is this: do not deny the hurt. Do not pretend invisibility feels easy. But refuse to let neglect turn your wisdom corrosive. Let pain refine you. Not rot you. Because perhaps, the strongest man after 50, is not the one who never felt ignored. It is the one who felt it deeply, and still refused to let that pain make him smaller, meaner, or easier to dismiss. Many men confuse being heard with being obeyed. And that confusion creates suffering. Because earlier in life, authority often came with direct outcomes. You gave instruction. People followed. You made decisions. Others adjusted. You carried responsibility, so your word had immediate consequence. But later in life, especially after children grow up and workplaces change, influence becomes different. Less direct. Less guaranteed. Less attached to control. And if you are not careful, you may interpret every independent decision as disrespect. Your son chooses differently. Your daughter listens, but still goes her own way. A younger colleague hears your warning, but tests their own approach. Your family considers your opinion, but does not follow it completely. And something in you says, they didn't listen. But maybe they did. Maybe they heard you. They simply did not obey. And after 50, learning the difference between those two things may save your relationships. Because if being heard only counts when people do what you say, then you will always feel disrespected. You will become frustrated with adult children who are trying to build their own judgment. You will become impatient with younger people who need to learn through experience. You will mistake autonomy for rejection. And eventually, your advice may begin to feel like pressure. Not because your wisdom is wrong, but because it arrives with an unspoken demand: if you respect me, you will choose what I choose. That is not wisdom. That is control disguised as care. Real authority after 50 requires a different discipline. You offer insight. You name what you see. You speak from experience. But you do not attach your dignity to whether they obey immediately. This is difficult. Because you may be right. You may see the mistake coming. You may understand consequences they cannot yet imagine. You may watch someone you love walk toward pain you tried to warn them about. And still, your role may not be to control the outcome. Your role may be to become a presence they can return to when the outcome teaches them what your words could not. That requires strength. A quieter strength than command. The strength to remain available without becoming controlling. The strength to speak clearly without needing to dominate. The strength to let people grow without interpreting every difference as dishonor. Because maybe the deepest form of being heard is not immediate obedience. Maybe it is becoming. A voice that stays inside someone long after the conversation ends. A voice they remember when life proves you right. A voice they trust because it did not humiliate them. A voice they come back to because it did not punish them for needing their own path. And perhaps that is the evolution of authority after 50, from command to influence. From control to presence. From needing obedience to becoming unforgettable. After 50, you may eventually realize something uncomfortable: people do not listen to you the same way anymore. And while painful, this can also become a powerful awakening. Because if old authority fades, then shallow authority dies with it. What remains must be real. This is where a new kind of masculine presence begins. Not louder. Not more defensive. Not constantly explaining itself. Sharper. Cleaner. More deliberate. Because the men who become most powerful later in life often stop confusing dominance with authority. They understand something deeper: presence is not how much space you force. It is how much weight your clarity carries when you finally use space. So the new kind of man after 50 changes. His posture changes. He does not slump into invisible resentment. He stands like he still belongs. His tone changes. He does not rush to prove. He speaks without the tremor of needing validation. His timing changes. He stops reacting to every small thing. He chooses moments. And because he chooses carefully, his words land harder. Imagine him at dinner. Warm overhead light. Children older now. Voices overlapping. Opinions everywhere. Years ago, he may have corrected too early. Taken over. Needed control. Now. He watches first. He studies the emotional weather of the room. He hears what people are saying, and what they are avoiding. He notices fear beneath confidence. Ego beneath certainty. Pain beneath defensiveness. Then, when he speaks, it is not long. Not dramatic. Not performative. One sentence. Clear. Grounded. Accurate. And suddenly, the room slows. Because true authority after 50 often sounds less like volume, and more like precision. This is what many men miss. They fear fading, so they increase force. But often, force is loud insecurity. Precision is mature power. And people feel that difference. A man who no longer needs constant recognition, but still carries visible standards, is powerful. A man who can remain emotionally steady, without becoming passive, is powerful. A man whose body, tone, and boundaries all communicate, I am here. I see clearly. I do not need to chase this room, is powerful. Because maybe, after 50, your greatest authority no longer comes from controlling outcomes. Maybe, it comes from embodied presence. The kind younger men notice. Families trust. And rooms eventually recalibrate around. Not because you demanded relevance. Because you became difficult to dismiss. There is a way of speaking after 50, that makes people close. And there is a way of speaking, that makes people lean in. The difference is not always the wisdom itself. Sometimes it is the emotional weight behind it. If your advice carries resentment, people feel the resentment first. If your warning carries fear, people feel the fear first. If your correction carries the hunger to be respected, people feel the hunger first. And then the wisdom gets buried beneath the need. This is why so many experienced men feel unheard. Not because they have nothing valuable to say. But because their delivery is carrying too many old wounds. A sentence that could have been guidance becomes accusation. A warning that could have been protection becomes control. A truth that could have landed becomes a lecture. And the listener pulls away. So the man says, see? No one listens. But maybe the problem was not the truth. Maybe it was the packaging of pain around the truth. If you want people to feel your wisdom after 50, you must learn to separate your insight from your injury. That does not mean hiding pain. It means not making pain the messenger. Imagine your adult child tells you a decision you think is risky. Your chest tightens. You want to say, that is a mistake. You never listen. I've seen this before. But instead, you breathe. You wait. You ask one question, what outcome are you hoping this creates? Now the conversation opens. Not because you became weak. Because you became strategic. You did not surrender your wisdom. You gave it a doorway. This is the skill many men after 50 need to reclaim influence, ask before advising. Name patterns without shaming. Speak from experience without demanding obedience. Offer one clear sentence instead of 10 emotional paragraphs. Let silence work. Let your calm become part of the message. Because when people feel respected in the way you speak, they become more available to what you know. This is not manipulation. It is maturity. It is the difference between needing to be right, and wanting to be useful. And perhaps that is one of the great shifts after 50, the younger version of you may have needed people to recognize your authority. But the wiser version of you learns how to make your authority easier to receive. Not smaller. Cleaner. Less wounded. More precise. Because wisdom that arrives cleanly can travel further. It can enter a room without forcing itself. It can stay in someone's mind without humiliating them. It can become a voice they return to later. And maybe that is how they begin listening again. Not because you said more. Because you finally spoke in a way they could carry. There is a painful temptation after 50, when you feel yourself becoming less consulted, to prove you still matter. To remind. To interrupt. To over-explain. To force visibility. And that temptation is human. Because invisibility can feel like erosion. But here is the brutal truth, begging for relevance rarely restores it. It often signals that you fear it is already gone. So the real question becomes, how does a man reclaim relevance, without chasing it? The answer is not nostalgia. Not louder opinions. Not bitterness. Refinement. Because relevance after 50 is not usually reclaimed by demanding your old place. It is reclaimed by becoming deeply useful in a new way. This requires a system, first. Sharpen what you know. Do not coast on old experience alone. Refine it. Translate it. Stay observant. Your wisdom must remain current enough to connect, not merely historical enough to impress. Second. Speak when useful, not merely when overlooked. Do not talk just to reinsert yourself. Speak where clarity creates value. When your words solve. Prevent. Stabilize. Illuminate. This immediately changes how people experience you. Now your presence feels strategic, not needy. Third. Become emotionally safe enough to be approached again. This is crucial. If people expect every interaction with you to carry correction, disappointment, or ego, they may avoid your wisdom before they ever hear it. But when your presence feels grounded, clear, and strong without humiliation, you become easier to return to. And return is where influence rebuilds. Because maybe, your next relevance is not about becoming the center of every room. Maybe, it is about becoming the man people increasingly realize they trust when things actually matter. This is different. Old relevance may have come from role. New relevance often comes from refinement. You stop trying to be needed constantly. You become respected consistently. And that shift changes everything. Because perhaps, after 50, the goal is not, make them remember who I was. Maybe, it is, become so clear, current, and grounded, that who I am now becomes undeniably valuable. Because relevance is not reclaimed through desperation. It is rebuilt through disciplined usefulness. And maybe, that is how men stop fading. Not by shouting louder. By becoming sharper. Here is the final truth. When people stop listening, your first instinct may be to disappear. Not physically. Emotionally. You stop offering. Stop engaging. Stop caring as visibly. You sit further back. Speak less. Tell yourself, they don't want to hear it anyway. And maybe part of that is self-protection. But if you are not careful, your withdrawal becomes the very thing that confirms your invisibility. They stop asking. You stop showing up. Then the distance grows. And everyone calls it natural. But maybe it was not natural. Maybe it was pain becoming silence. This is the moment that decides what kind of man you become after 50. Because one path leads to bitterness. A man who was once needed, now sitting in quiet resentment, waiting for people to realize what they lost. But another path exists. A harder path. A more powerful path. The path where you do not chase the room, but you also do not abandon your place in it. You keep your presence clean. Your voice sharp. Your timing disciplined. Your heart open enough not to rot into bitterness. You stop needing constant consultation as proof of worth. But you also stop pretending your wisdom has no value just because people forgot to ask. This is reclamation. Not sadness. Not nostalgia. Reclamation. Because the next season of your life is not about forcing people to need you like before. It is about becoming a man whose relevance no longer depends on desperation. A man who can stand inside a room that overlooked him, without shrinking, without exploding, without begging, and still carry weight. That is rare. And maybe that is what makes people listen again. Not immediately. Not always. But eventually. Because a man who no longer begs to matter, but refuses to disappear, becomes difficult to ignore. So if they stop listening, let it hurt. But do not. Let it harden you into silence. Let it refine you. Let it teach you precision. Let it strip away the need to be obeyed. Let it rebuild your presence into something quieter, stronger, cleaner, more undeniable. Because perhaps after 50, the question is no longer, why don't they ask me anymore? Maybe the question is, what kind of man will I become, now that I must earn my voice again? And maybe, that is not the end of your relevance. Maybe, that is where your real authority begins. In the next episode, we go even deeper. What happens when no one rejects you, but you slowly realize, you have become optional? That is where the next chapter begins.